In many academic disciplines, people make a distinction between primary and secondary sources. But it's not necessarily an easy distinction, or at least not as easy as it appears. And if you were looking at a shelf full of books like we have here, would you be able to tell which ones are primary and secondary? Well, let's see if we can help you with that. So we have a list here of primary and secondary sources, and the idea is that a primary source is closer to the action. So close to the action. Some people say it's a first-hand source, but in some ways that's a problematic description because first-hand implies that the person who is writing or taking a photograph is right there, right at the action, is a witness to the events. And that may not actually be the case. So primary means just close to the action as opposed to further removed. So secondary means at least one step removed from the action. And you'll see in a little bit what we mean by this. So a primary source then is a source that's more immediate, more direct, and a secondary source is, well, secondary. It's commenting on something. It's using primary sources to come up with some kind of conclusion. So if we go back to our photograph here, we can make a few distinctions then. If you look, for instance, at the history book right in the center here, this is the Penguin History of New Zealand. This may seem like a primary source because it's dealing with history. And inside it, there may actually be primary sources. For instance, quotations from letters of people who were there, or diaries, or photographs. But the thing itself, the book itself, is really a secondary source because it's collecting all of these things. The author was not there, let's say, 100 years ago. And so most of this book is really a secondary source that takes material from the past and puts it together in some sort of unified form. An example of a primary source would be something like a book of philosophy written not by somebody much later, but written by an actual philosopher. Well, the later critic could be a philosopher too, I suppose, but the idea is that here we have, for instance, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. It's very immediate, it's his philosophy, and it's not somebody later writing about him. If you look at this final source here on the right, you'll see that this is a field guide to trees. That would be a secondary source because it's really a collection of research that borrows from many other different sources, books, let's say, on specific specific trees, and it puts all of this together into some kind of format that synthesizes the material. Maybe one more example here. If you look over here, we have a book on Martin Luther. Again, it's a historical analysis, but it's not by Martin Luther himself. It's by somebody called Nichols, and that would make it a secondary source. Let's go back to our list then, and we'll just focus here on two subjects and how those subjects use primary and secondary sources. So the first would be a subject such as literature, and if you're writing a literature paper, the most common way to use primary and secondary sources is to look for an original book, or some kind of literary text, and that could be a poem, could be a play, and then you want to analyze it, and so you're going to look for academic books or articles that have something to say about it. And that just means that your primary text is the thing that you're analyzing, the play, the novel, the poem, and your secondary sources are all the critics and so on who talk about that primary text. But of course, there are lots of other sources you can bring in that are maybe closer in terms of history. So let's say you're talking about Shakespeare and you really want to put in your essay some comments by Ben Jonson, let's say, who's also writing at roughly the same time. Well, there would still be a primary source. Even if that particular author says something about Shakespeare, we still consider that a primary source because it's so close to the action. And that's where history makes quite a bit of difference in thinking about this distinction. So when we think about history, things that are in the past, that are closer to the action, are seen as more immediate, whereas things that are later, that comment on the past, are seen as secondary. The second subject we can think about is history, and this is where this distinction is definitely very important as well. Let's say that you're doing an analysis of Mata Hari, the Parisian exotic dancer who was executed as a spy, supposedly, in 1917. Well, where would you start? I think you would start by trying to find as many primary sources as possible. You would look at newspapers of the time, trying to figure out what the people say about her. Did she leave any letters, or did other people leave letters in which they talk about her? Diaries and autobiographies. And again, we said this has to be just close to the action. It doesn't have to be an eyewitness. So it could be somebody in 1917 writing about what they heard in terms of the news, and that's still a primary source even if they did not see or witness her execution. You could look at legal records, and in fact in her espionage case there were lots of legal records, but some of them were even doctored and falsified, and it seems that she was definitely framed in that case. Photographs of her, buildings from the time where we have a sense of where she was living and where she performed and so on. So lots of things that we can use as primary sources. And then we can add to that secondary sources. So this would be people who have written about her in, let's say, biographies, any film documentaries that we may have about her, or even actual films. We could look her up in an encyclopedia, and we could even look up her name, Mata Hari, in a dictionary because it seems to be of Malay origin. So what does it mean? Some people call these sources, encyclopedias and dictionaries, they call these tertiary sources. Tertiary meaning third hand. So the reason for that is that a dictionary, let's say, finds its definitions by looking at all sorts of secondary sources as well as primary sources, and then comes up with suitable definitions. That's just more of an aside because I don't think the distinction matters that much, and we just consider them here as secondary sources. What you can see then is that it's not an exact science thinking about primary and secondary sources, but I hope at least this overview gives you a little bit of a sense of how you can tell the difference.